The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Wirkus, and it's always my pleasure to have her as a recurring guest, clearly our most frequently recurring guest on the podcast, and someone who, when we get that merch store, we're going to have Dr. Angelo Giardino merch. Angelo, if you could choose what kind of merch you would want to be featured on, what would you choose?
Like a t-shirt or maybe I think a medallion actually. Like the big Middle Ages medallions that
Sure.
like mayors in England wear with the big chain and the big circle right in the chest.
So you would have the option either of hanging it from a chain or maybe from like one of those big silky sort of things.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd wear it all the time and then I would pronounce things and everyone would have to listen to me.
I would probably pronounce them wrong. That's my problem. Well, we're very fortunate this month, again, to be reading a book that I think we both enjoyed, a book
Uh-huh.
by Florence Williams, The Nature Fix, in which she talks about the fact that, did you know that being in nature is a good thing?
It is amazing that we needed to go to a book to figure that out, but it turns out it's true, Paul.
And for the two of us right now located in Utah, it's interesting because as she talked about nature, she was in places that are a half day's drive of where we are right now. That
Right.
we could go to Moab, we could be in the Sawtooths easily in a half day. And let's be honest, in our commutes to work, wherever we're going, we're surrounded by mountains in this valley. And so we can see we have visiting privileges to nature. I think that what she's encouraging us to do is to make nature a real part of our lives and a real destination. I wanted to start with a quote that she started with. She mentions it in her introduction. I wanted to put the quote into context. This is from the great Annie Dillard from her book, The Writing Life. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule defends from chaos and whim. It is a net for catching days. It is a scaffolding on which a worker can stand and labor with both hands at sections of time. I think she mentions that at first because intentionality about nature is meaningful. Tell me what you thought of the book.
Well, I really enjoyed it because it walked me through in a very organized way some of the she's an investigative journalist, so she definitely, found some of the science. She interviewed some of the scientists and she spent time with them. And she just walks through what I think I know intuitively that being in nature is restorative. And obviously, I think we all kind of experience that, but she walks us through the different senses and some of the literature and some of the demonstration projects. So it gives me a little bit more confidence that it is something that I personally and that all of us should incorporate into our day, week, month, year. So I really liked it. I thought she did a really good job at really sharing her experience. So she lived in Colorado. And then I think because her spouse's job changed, she ended up moving to Washington, D.C., which of course is very different than Colorado. And the nature that she was experiencing in Colorado was completely different in Washington, where she just didn't resonate with the city noises and the kind of the physical layout. And I thought she shared that really nice personal experience. But in the context of sharing that, then she walks us through why nature is restorative. And I found it really an affirming, positive, inspirational book. And frankly, at this point in my life, I need to have some things that are inspirational and affirmative. So I really enjoyed reading the book.
To your point of the noise thing, she talks about living under the flight pattern for an airport. And I just made a
Yeah.
note here that she cites a study where they followed several thousand students in the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands, and those living near airports had lower reading comprehension and memory as well as higher hyperactivity. And for every 5 decibel increase in noise, reading scores dropped by 2 months. So she refers to this thing anything that you can reduce I think to a three-letter term, I think means that it's really important. She talks about attention restoration theory, ART, and there's a lot of evidence that she cites. Contact with nature, contact with actual nature is helpful, but also even contact with simulation of nature, looking at pictures of nature helps to some extent with mood and stuff.
Yeah, and again, with regard to the sound, she does a good job of talking about how disruptive some of the city sounds are. But then she walks us through kind of water, wind, bird songs. And then she kind of takes a detour and talks a little bit about how bird songs are similar to music and how restorative having a playlist is. And then, of course, when you're in nature, the music is the bird song. So I thought she did a good job at pointing that out. And again, it's just kind of intuitive, but it makes sense. Certainly in the springtime, when I start hearing the birds more, I do feel better. Little did I know that there's like brain chemistry that's doing that. But she points that out, which I think she does a good job at doing.
She also makes, I think, a good point that there's both immediate and lasting benefits from being in nature. And there again, I think that it's important and it seems intuitively right that finding a way, and she's not just talking about, going to the forest and just spending 6 weeks in the forest, but she's also talking about protecting green spaces and going to the park
Yeah.
and doing things where you have contact with nature.
She kind of focuses in the senses initially in the first couple chapters. So she talks a lot about forests, and there's several countries that are really promoting parks and forests and almost in terms of like ecotherapy. But what I thought was interesting is like some of the trees emit aerosols. And when I was reading it, it sounded like Vicks. Like there's a reason why Vicks Vapor Rub works, and it's because that's the smell of a tree. And
Right.
like when you're in a forest, if you're in one of those evergreen forests, you may very well smell stuff that smells like Vicks, and it does open up your airways, and you feel better when you can breathe in a more comfortable way. So she really, I think, brought that out in kind of she has a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek style, but she talks about Japan and Korea where they're really serious about studying trips to forests and walking. And then she then segues eventually into Finland, where apparently the Finns are among the happiest people on earth. And I wrote down, I think 74% of the land in Finland has trees on it. So the Finns are very much into getting into nature, and she goes through all those statistics. But it kind of makes sense. Like for the culture she was explaining in Finland, getting outside is just really part of who they are. It's not a project. And she contrasts we in the US. I think going into nature is like one more task that you put on your to-do list that week. But it
Yeah.
sounds like it's just life.
And a country as well that has traditionally been one of the least urban countries in the world. And so not only is there a lot of forest, but the likelihood of being near the forest is much greater if you're not living in a big city. I wanted to mention a little bit about the Singapore experience because
Okay.
Singapore has really, I think, tried to make a concerted effort as one of the most densely populated places in the world to also invite nature into that. Do you remember any of that?
She went through the one leader who was in charge for like 40 years, and they really made a commitment to incorporating parks and green space just about everywhere. That's like part of their vision and mission statement, it sounds like.
Green spaces, including on walls and on roofs,
Yeah.
installing green space wherever possible, which is kind of a great idea.
Well, and then she connected that, and I think we kind of know this in hospitals where people do better if they have the bed that has the window view.
Yeah,
And Florence Nightingale knew that. Florence Nightingale made it really clear like hospital rooms have to have windows because patients do better. And, that was some of the early epidemiology that the patients closer to the windows did better. And she documents all that. And then she kind of segues then into like in certain prisons, the prisoners that have views that are green actually have less episodes of violence and out of control behavior than the inmates who are looking at a gray wall. So again, she did a nice job at kind of articulating some of the science that shows that being near green space, visualizing green space, experiencing it, having sunlight is really helpful.
one of her chapters, she deals with a group of women veterans with PTSD who
Right.
go to the Sawtooths in Idaho. as a therapeutic measure to deal with their PTSD. And it seems like that there should be great potential in something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the stories that she told in that part of the book were just very poignant because these women veterans had really experienced very difficult circumstances. But she walks everybody through how liberating it was and restorative for most of them. I think she's balanced. You know, she's honest about herself that every kind of experience with nature hasn't been positive, and some of the veterans I think had different experiences.
Right, right.
She also connected it to ADHD, and to me, that made a lot of sense. Where I think programs like Outward Bound and a few others, where they allow the kids to be in nature and frankly have responsibilities to kind of do things. And I just think, Paul, if I reflect back a couple podcast ago, we talked about the anxious generation and how it's helpful for kids to have some responsibility and to have some playtime that they can kind of do trial and error. And I feel like she showed us a little bit of how kids with ADHD benefit from almost like the natural playtime, but also the responsibility that comes in being in nature and having tasks that have to be accomplished.
Yeah, I was fascinated in that light that as she talks about the origins of kindergarten, kindergarten
Oh,
has
yeah.
its German name, the Garden of Children, that in Prussia, for goodness sake, is certainly one of the most loosey-goosey historical places in the world, that the notion of kindergarten was children would be in nature having an unstructured time to help their development, which is, not exactly the way we head with kindergarten these days.
Yeah, yeah, no, because she's a journalist, she kind of takes you then down these things. So that's why it's a really nice read. It's a great one, I think, to have on a long flight because she has a kind of an engaging writing style. And then I'm not much of a mathematician, but she did talk about when you go on a walk in nature, like in a forest or, kind of in a natural scene, that the patterns in nature seem to be she uses the word fractal, which I think means some sort of like naturally repetitive structure, like a fern leaf, but that we cue on those and that those are kind of engaging and pleasurable for us to see those. And we're used to scanning those as opposed to some of the sites that you see in an urban landscape where you don't have that kind of natural pattern to things. And that to me also confirmed, I think, what we know that like certain natural things look a lot more pleasant to look at than looking at a big tall building.
It was interesting that she also mentioned that someone had studied Jackson Pollock's paintings and found that they had a fractal nature, and that's how they uncovered some fraudulent Jackson Pollock art. Is that it
Yeah,
didn't represent fractals, and the guy who did the studies said he was really nervous until about having said, "Now this is a fraud," till they discovered the paint was also too new as well. But
yeah, right, right.
it is interesting because even something as abstract as Jackson Pollock, it sounds resonates with us. It goes back to the way that nature resonates with us. And I think our experience of nature is an important thing for us to continually reinforce. And it sounds like it must, on some deeper level, be good for us.
Well, the other thing she talked about, which again makes a lot of sense, is this idea of going for a walk. And going for a walk in nature is like kind of a double dose of good things. And then she talks about some of the authors that talked about going for walks and some of the philosophers. And it kind of makes sense, like you clear your head, but that's true. It actually has neuroscience behind it. And not that I know anything about alpha waves, but apparently it promotes them, and that's a good thing.
That's good. Well, and the risk for the way that we live currently is that I went for a walk today. Well, what did it sound like? Well, I had my headphones in. Well, what did it look like? Well, I was on my phone. I think that the intentionality of being able to unplug at the very
Yes.
least, it seems like there's an advantage. And to miss out on nature seems like we're missing out on something big.
Well, I liked how she concludes the book with one of the investigators that she highlights uses the nutritional pyramid or the food pyramid as a metaphor. You're supposed to have so many servings of vegetables and fruits and whatever. But for nature, she talks about on a daily basis, you should make sure that you're disciplining yourself to get outside, look at the greenery, listen to the birds, and then on a weekly basis, go for a walk. On a monthly basis, make sure that you get out into some sort of natural setting. And then obviously on a yearly basis, making sure you get a nice big dose of nature. And I think there was some work that she alluded to where you need 3 full days at least in nature to truly get the maximal benefit of being in the wild.
Yeah, let me just highlight that, by the way, because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to David Strayer, who's at the University of Utah and has done a lot of work on attention, some important work, I think, especially about multitasking, that nobody multitasks very well. But yeah, he talks about a third day effect, that cognitive clarity improves after 72 hours in nature, that there's EEG evidence that there's improved attention and reduced brain fatigue, and reduces cortisol, lowers blood pressure and heart rate, improved mood, creativity, and sleep quality. That's all desirable.
Yeah, well, as you say that, it reminds me, she spent a little bit of time talking about a set of investigators that she spent time with, and they really focused on attention and how nature has a way of almost like recharging our batteries, because in the more complicated, busy, disconnected lives that we lead in more of an urban setting, our attention gets very distracted, if you will. But when you're in nature, you can almost recharge your attention centers. And that's part of why it's restorative.
Yeah. Well, I was glad to read this book in the spring. It seemed like a great spring book
Yeah.
because, yeah, not only do I want to get out and about, but even digging in the garden and getting the tomatoes in, I think it's got a smell in the dirt there too.
Yeah. Well, again, it's because you're touching the dirt. And
That's,
apparently, according to her, dirt has microorganisms that somehow help you. So there's a lot of reasons why nature is healthy for you, Paul. You should get out there.
I made this dirt out of compost. It is fine dirt, Angelo.
Well, this is a good way to end the podcast talking about compost.
Well, thanks so much for the recommendation. Thanks for the chance to talk about it. Again, the book is The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. I think it's a good read. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, but I think the most interesting thing for me is it really made me want to get out and spend more time in nature and take advantage of that.
Yeah, same here. So thanks.
All right. We'll have to come up with another book in a couple of months.
Okie doke.
Nice talking to you, Angelo.
Same here.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The Virtual Curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design, thanks to Phil Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.